You're on.
Over to you, Paresh, sir. We're live.
Hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation With. In Conversation With is a part of the CASI New York Knowledge Series. What happens is we invite senior management practitioners from across the world under the theme of sustainability and try to get executable advice. So today we have a very strong panel. We have people from across the world. So we have United States, United Kingdom, Chile, South Africa, and we have special guests from Poland and China to ask questions. So this is going to be a very interesting session. Our first speaker will be Shameela Soobramoney. She's the Chief Sustainability Officer of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. So let's hear it from Shameela. Shameela, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Professor Paresh. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today and to be reaching your network and your audience. I really hope that I'll be able to add some value to them and share some insights as to what I've come across in my few years now working in the field and with a background in corporate strategy and finance, and then now, of course, embracing sustainability in its entirety. I'd just like to share my screen. Okay. Just want to make sure, are you able to see?
Yes.
Fantastic, thank you. So what I really want to cover today is a sense of why this matters, and some of that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, but just to recap from our perspective, coming from a stock exchange, sometimes people might think, sustainability issues are green issues, they're warm and fuzzy, and they're not things that are matter to the markets or necessarily can be attributed directly to value, trading, and the like. I'm hoping today that I can leave you with some key messages. The first one being that it is material. The second one being that there are serious consequences if we don't act now to consider sustainability, because our time is really short in this regard, and that there are new ways of doing business that we need to embrace if we want to have any hope of achieving a future that we really would like to have, retire into, and create for our children. And that from a returns perspective, the increasing evidence is that it is supporting better returns. So let me get to the nub of it very quickly. If we look at the definition and the genesis, it's really coming from this disconcert that society has been showing and dissatisfaction with the way in which business has been done up to now. In a nutshell, what that means is that often the development models that we've pursued have internalized profit and externalized the cost to society and to the environment. So the models that we haven't properly costed in the impacts of doing business, particularly on society and on the environment. And so an entire reset and a rethink of capitalism fundamentally is what we're starting to see the shift towards. Is this easy? No. Is it widely embraced? Of course not that easily. But does it need to happen? It certainly does. So this explicit consideration of environmental and social issues and governance issues into the business models is really what we're talking about when we talk about sustainability and about creating a future that we want to have. This is a very quick model, I'll leave the slides with you, that really tries to encapsulate in a word what we're talking about, and saying that there's an explicit recognition that we have ecological boundaries for the planet, and that if we start functioning outside of those boundaries, the consequences are potentially things that we cannot even model. We're talking about natural systems, and we cannot function on a planet that is failing. Recent studies have shown that up to 60% of global GDP is dependent on nature, more so in emerging markets and developing countries. So the case to consider this is an absolutely compelling one, even from an economic perspective. The consequences of not doing it, an historic underinvestment, we're seeing very clearly in the crisis that we're living to right now in COVID. Debt levels are at historic highs around the world. We are seeing the economic impact of not investing. If we had invested better, we wouldn't be needing to draw down on these levels of debt to help our economy survive this pandemic. This pandemic is one of those that is what we call, coming from what we call zoonotic diseases, and is a direct consequence of not considering the environment in the development models that we have pursued up to date. So achieving societal equity and developing that social foundation within the ecological boundaries is essentially the sustainability challenge that we're faced with now. So how can we grow sustainably? So if we look at that and we look at governance, South Africa is home to one of the foremost governance codes in the world in the form of the King Codes of Corporate Governance. And King explicitly talks about the need and sets the foundation for the triple context of people, profit, and planet. So no longer is this a nice to have sideshow. This is something that is considered fundamental to good governance. And every company, every country, every institution understands that governance is important. But what governance is asking you to do now is to consider the longer term explicitly. King talks to the paradigm shifts that we're seeing from financial capital to inclusive capitalism, short-term capital markets to longer-term sustainable capital markets, and really from a siloed financial reporting view to an integrated one that says we need to report and think in a manner that explicitly considers this. So I want to move quickly to sustainable finance then. So in that context, what is the role of markets? The role of markets ultimately or fundamentally is the capital allocation function. And as the saying goes, money makes the world go round. Markets are conduit for trillions of dollars of capital around the world in every country. And so are pivotal to sustainable development, because what we really need is the reallocation of capital towards more sustainable outcomes. And so how markets then are structured and facilitate that and able to create the enabling environment for that to happen becomes absolutely critical. How we price risk, how we reward long-term action is all critical in the market function. Now, many of you listening today are probably students of finance, students of sustainability, and probably didn't come to think you're going to listen to a market allocation discussion. But this is critical because everything we do and how we think about finance and how we think about the markets is critical to achieving these outcomes that are fundamental to all of us. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the idea is that it will take at least $2.5 trillion annually more funding to achieve these goals. And many of these goals, deficiencies sit predominantly in developing countries and emerging markets. So the need for us to embrace this globally and be able to reallocate those capital flows is pressing. But on the flip side, there are huge opportunities that could be created in approaching the markets in the right way. Every business wants opportunity. There are massive opportunities to be able to fill the achievement of the SDGs. And the estimates say that just 3% of GDP is going to get us close to achieving the SDGs. Consider what we're currently spending on debt just to finance the outcome, the fallout from the pandemic. There's a case that's very clear. So when we talk about responsible investment, it is the explicit inclusion of ESG factors or your sustainability factors into investment decision making. There are a number of ways in which that can be done. If we look at the principles for responsible investment, it gives us a clear case for how to build a portfolio on using integration of these factors into investment decision making, screening, you could use negative screening, and I won't go into the detail of all of the strategies because these are relatively easy to find. Suffice to say, what does this mean from a monetary flow perspective? And let's look at the numbers. So if we look at this, the total assets under management globally that are following some kind of responsible investment strategy at last count in 2018 was about $30 trillion. It's expected to go up to around 40 to 50, 45 trillion by the end of this year. That is huge change. If you look at the different regions and where this is looked at, the growth has been exponential, essentially, in virtually every major region in the world. And if we look at that and we look at the definition of what that means, yes, definitions can be a bit tricky, and that is an area that is plaguing sustainable finance at the moment. But nonetheless, the explicit effort is what I think that we need to focus on. Europe, of course, is defining these numbers largely, and the many regulatory changes that Europe is setting in place is set to really start changing the world stage and actually having extraterritorial implications. So the need to understand this and where the world is going, this is critical for us to see. But we can see from the numbers that this is not a sideshow. This is becoming the mainstream investment. And if we look at things like bonds, I mean, one of the key issues the key instruments that we consider is green bonds. These have grown year on year, including this year under COVID circumstances, to show that there is serious money that is looking to invest in these products. Mostly these products have been oversubscribed. South African market, 4 to 5 times oversubscribed for those green bonds listed on the JSE. So this is where money is ring-fenced and allocated directly to the kinds of activities that are congruent with a lower carbon and sustainable economy. Social bonds and sustainability bonds likewise have been growing, and this is where the use of the money is explicitly earmarked for spending on projects that are social in nature, education outcomes, health and outcomes and the like, and sustainable, of course, bonds are the linkage between green and social to bring those together. COVID crisis, again, social bonds have seen a rise in that regard and have been one of the instruments that have been used to raise finance in that. If we look at the performance of the market, let's look at sustainable funds, ETFs, and the like, as well as indices. The cumulative monthly flows for all SRI and ESG equity funds globally have just been seen to be growing exponentially. This graph shows you the white line is all ESG SRI funds versus all equity funds in total. And you can see the trajectory there versus the one going up being the ESG SRI funds and the other one really showing a downward trend. So whereas we're seeing equity funds as a whole going down, we're actually seeing SRI and ESG ones doing the opposite, telling you that investors are seeing the case for this. So we can, and I've mentioned already about the global numbers in that, but this year alone, the flows into sustainable funds were up 72% in the second quarter, if we look at the research and the history on that. So in the first half, we've seen a number of ETFs being repurposed into ESG ETFs following this trend. The US has been accounting for about 15% of global inflows, and very interesting because it's a big market, whereas Europe has dominated. We're seeing the US take that stance very quickly, notwithstanding the federal government stance. The global cumulative ETF inflows, we can see similarly, we've talked about this, the sustainable ETFs, which is the orange line, have been going up and up and up. The traditional ETFs, not so much. Just in actual flows, in dollar terms, the ESG ETFs are overtaking. So investors are seeing that this is a clear value proposition, and not only is the funds going there, but the performance of those funds is also shown to be, in most cases, top quartile performance for ETFs. If we look at indices, so the percentage of sustainable indices that have outperformed during downturns, and this is looking at the 32 most referenced and analyzed ETFs in the world. The top left, 78%, and this is now talking to different terms, not just what we're seeing right now. This point is about these funds showing resilience in times of crises, whereas we're often seeing market downturns. These kinds of indices have actually proven the opposite and proven to be more resilient. During the COVID crisis, 94% of those ETFs have outperformed the market benchmarks. During the emerging market and energy downturn in February 2015, 2016, 78% of ESG indices have outperformed the market benchmarks. So I ask you, where would you have had your money? In the market benchmark or in the ESG ETFs? So when we look at the performance and we try to attribute, some of the critics have said that a lot of the performance is because of the fact that the weighting has been steered away from some of the energy companies, and so would have been negatively impacted. Those that had the energy companies would have been negatively impacted by oil price falls. And so that's why ESG funds who tend to stay away from fossil have actually outperformed. In fact, that criticism is not true, because BlackRock, one of the largest investors in the world, has said that that outperformance has been driven by a range of material sustainability characteristics. Things like how a company has job satisfaction for their employees, the strength of their customer relationships, the effectiveness of the board. These intangible factors is actually what they have found to be the driver behind the outperformance, and not simply the fact that it hadn't included energy companies. So very, very interesting that they say that it was a very small percentage of the being underweight in energy that was actually the reason for the outperformance of these indices. So if we look at that, COVID-19 has really said to us and strengthened that case, and the investment case for ESG and for sustainability. If I look at the performance in emerging markets, so a lot of those are global funds. Let's try and hone in on emerging markets. So this is the MSCI Emerging Markets Leaders Index and the MSCI Emerging Markets. So the ESG Leaders Index is the blue line, and the orange line is the Emerging Markets Benchmark Index. You can see that over that period up to April 2020, so I haven't updated, but it still shows the same trend. The outperformance of the benchmark at 107.74 and the 166.63 for the Emerging Market ESG Leaders Index. So the ESG Leaders Index would be those companies that were best in class and taken the best in class per sector and put those together into an index. So the top performing ESG scoring companies per sector put together in that index, and then as an agglomeration is actually outperformed the benchmark. If I look to South Africa, this is the JSE FTSE Responsible Investment Index series, which also scores companies on the ESG. And if we look at that, the Responsible Investment Top 30 Index, which is the top 30 highest performing ESG scoring companies, from the time of inception of the indices in 2015 to now, has outperformed all the benchmark indices on the JSE. So again, for us going from global to emerging market to local context to show that the trend has been similar across the board. So I hope that I leave you with some food food for thought today, and really a sense that if we don't invest in the future that we want, and the evidence is overwhelming, we're going to end up with what we're going to get is going to be worth infinitely less. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Samira, for that presentation. I must confess, I was not aware of so much action in South Africa in terms of sustainable bonds. There is a lot of action going there, so we should. I should probably take this offline and set up an office there. So a trading office. I have a question for you. See, the historically, the primary job of a stock exchange is liquidity, to provide liquidity to the stocks. So with this new focus on sustainability, where you reach out to promoters of companies and sort of harass them, okay, let's be sustainable. Does it deter new companies from listing, or how does it happen from a stock exchange point of view globally, not only from South Africa? Globally, does it
Sure.
deter founders from listing?
So, Professor, what you're talking about is making the case for leveling of the playing field. So, exchanges, most of them are businesses in their own right. And so, of course, are faced with, how do we compete with other markets in the world? And so, if one listings requirement are more stringent than the other, is there then the tendency for an issuer to favor the less kind of stringent jurisdiction versus the more stringent jurisdiction? And so this has been a debate that's been brewing for a long time, which is why I think we're seeing in most markets in the world up to now, the focus on sustainability has been more on creating the enabling environment rather than the explicit listing rule that requires sustainability disclosure. So the governance framework is really the one that we want to strengthen, and that's certainly the approach that we've taken in South Africa, that sustainability thinking is core in good governance, and you have to do that. And so the JSE, for example, has incorporated the King codes into its listings requirement, and King asks for the explicit consideration of that. What it doesn't do is be prescriptive. This is what you have to report on. This is the framework you have to use, and this is the indicator you have to disclose. And so that sort of model and the guidance and the creating the enabling environment and the push in that way is what we're seeing globally, except for the fact in jurisdiction, or for where the jurisdictions are, where there is other regulation that is pushing those requirements for companies. So I very much see the role of the exchange as being creating that enabling environment, helping companies to understand why it matters, showing the evidence, and creating the guidance and that enabling framework for them to do so, so that you're finding the delicate balance between over-prescriptive and burdensome regulation versus needing to meet the aims of sustainability, which ultimately is for the good of the market. Because let's face it, if companies start reducing value, liquidities in the stock's going to go away anyway, because investors don't want it and they stop trading in it.
Correct. No. Thank you very much for that answer. You have put it very finely. There is a delicate balance which stock exchanges also need to maintain while coercing people to go more and more towards sustainability. So yes, you are absolutely right. Before we go on to our next speaker, Samira Khan, I have an announcement. Hayden, a very close friend, has joined us. Hayden is the 2017-20 CEO for the Securities Exchange Board at Trinidad and Tobago. So welcome to the show, Hayden.
Thank you, Mr. Sheth. I kind of clocked in a bit late, but I do have a question for Ms. Khan. You have indicated that the reporting and disclosure requirements are flexible in relation to sustainability, but are there any sort of basic reporting and disclosure requirements? I don't know if you touched on it in your presentation, because as I said, I came in.
So the basic reporting and disclosure requirements are, of course, encapsulated within the listings rules of the exchange. And that, of course, in South Africa, we have a self-regulatory model. So the JSC actually does develop the rules, but of course there is a government entity, which is the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, who of course has to rubber stamp any of those rules. But the JSC, I guess, is the lead regulator in that regard. And so from that perspective, we have chosen to adopt the King codes, and that is a must do. So any listed company has to report in accordance with the King codes of corporate governance, and therefore do the King requirements on what we call an apply and explain regime. So King has in itself obviously developed over time, and currently in King 4, so the 4th iteration of King, and that apply and explain. So look at what King is asking you to do, apply it and explain how you've applied it. And even if you can't apply it, you kind of have to explain why you haven't done it. So that's the regime for governance. In terms of the specific disclosure requirements, the JS has taken one step further and then said in some of the requirements, King, and this is particularly now in relation to ESG and governance, King, for example, recommends that you need to look at gender diversity and racial diversity in a country like South Africa. You understand why that's important. And so we've taken that and codified it under the governance section. So these become must-dos, not apply and explain. This is must-do. The first one in relation to ESG is that companies have to report on gender diversity at a board level annually, and they have to also report on what their plan is in relation to how they are improving gender diversity. And so that is a disclosure that has to be done every year for a company listed on the JSE. The second one in relation to ESG is on racial diversity at a board level as well. So what are you doing to do that, and what is your plan in that regard? The third one is on remuneration. So every company has to put to vote annually its remuneration policy. Now, in a country that also is home to one of the most unequal societies in the world, one can understand why remuneration actually has a very strong role to play. It's a non-binding advisory vote that you have to put to the AGM. If 25% or more of shareholders are dissenting or don't vote against that particular remuneration policy, then the company is also obliged to engage with the dissenting voters and at the next financial report to report back in its report on what the outcome of that engagement was. So what he's trying to do is create that disclosure framework and pushing action by doing that. And those are the three particular indicators that are a must do. The rest, of course, is in the apply and explain regime, and it is up to the board and the governing body of the company to apply its mind to what is material. And there's a lot of guidance on integrated reporting in that regard, and then to be able to disclose accordingly to its stakeholders, with the primary responsibility being for the board, the governing body, and the management team to apply its mind to these issues and how it needs to disclose them.
Thank you very much for that answer. I have one more announcement. Francis has joined us from Malaysia. Francis is also a strong supporter of CASI. He has been a speaker at our seminars. Welcome to the seminar, Francis. Francis is based in Malaysia, and he works for Acquio, the sustainability reporting software. So he basically, forces us to report sustainability in an easier way. Yeah. So we have a question for Samira. The next speaker, of course, is Samira, and Samira, we would like to hear your point of view. After all, the name is "What's Your Angle?" So we would like to hear her angle. But before that, I have a small question for you. The IT industry, is a non-pollutant. So the IT industry is very safe. You guys are responsible for 2% of the climate versus, let's say, agriculture, which is responsible for 20% of the climate change. So when we talk to IT people, they are usually that we are good, we are cool, we are a sustainable company, and I always tell them that we should measure IT companies in terms of how much they have enabled other companies to be sustainable, and not sustainability at your own company. So do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think both the positive and the negative impacts of your business on sustainability and the climate are important. I would say in the case of Salesforce, climate change is a top priority of ours. It's very close to our executives. It aligns very closely to our purpose. So we are making both a positive commitment as well as trying to mitigate negative sort of impacts. We like to walk the walk and lead the way. So I think in light of that, we're also trying to play a leading role in terms of what we think other tech companies should be doing. But I thought it was a very interesting question. I actually thought it was going a little bit of a different direction. I thought you were going to ask, if they're not a pollutant with regards to the environment, what are they in fact a pollutant with? And there's a lot of, as you know, negative sort of impacts of technology as well. Perhaps not in the climate domain though.
No, because IT is an enabler, and most companies rely on IT companies to enable them to work on sustainability. So if an IT company is not really enabling other people, then that is a problem. So as an IT company, the onus lies on the IT company to enable more and more of other companies so that they become sustainable.
Absolutely. And I think I'll cover a little bit of that in my presentation as an example of how Salesforce does it. I mean, we have Sustainability Cloud, which is helping other corporations track their carbon footprint. So we've developed a product that specifically focuses on enabling others to better measure and manage their impact with regards to sustainability. So no, I totally, I see where you're coming from. So should I get started?
Please.
Great. Okay. Just gonna share my screen. Give me a second. It's giving me an error. 1 second here. It's actually not letting me share my screen, but I've sent my slides. Is somebody else able to present them?
Dr. Mitesh, could you help?
For some reason, it's never done this before. It's just not letting me.
Sure, give me a minute.
Okay, I can drop the link too. Do that. Are you able to share them? I just sent the link. Paresh, if you want to move on to the next speaker while we work this out, that's also an option. I'm just saying it's taking a minute and everyone's waiting.
Sure, Mitesh, is that okay?
Yeah, just give me a minute. I'm almost done.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, if you just go into present mode, that would be perfect.
I'm not able to find the present mode. Perfect. Here it is.
Yeah, okay, great. So as mentioned, I am at Salesforce.org, and I'm going to talk about how companies actually drive purpose and bring impact to life. So I actually sit on the impact measurement and management team at Salesforce.org, which is the social impact business unit, or one of the social impact business units at Salesforce. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, so if you think of our CEO, one quote you'll hear often is that our CEO likes to talk about business's purpose as being to improve the state of the world. So we are a CRM company. We're a customer/constituent relationship management platform. And we really like to view ourselves as connectors. We are bringing together various companies. We are bringing together various stakeholders, including our employees and our partners, onto one platform. And you'll often see Mark talk about the entire purpose as being to improve the state of the world. And so our key, the way we articulate our work is we are using business as a platform for change. And what do we mean by platform? By platform, we mean our technology, we mean our people, we mean our relationships, and we also mean our capital. So especially as you think of ourselves in a time of pandemic right now, we have multiple crises we're facing. We're facing climate change, we're facing the effects of COVID-19 on some of the most vulnerable populations. And in addition to that, if you look at the US in particular, we're facing sort of a racial justice crisis. In addition to that, there's increasing sort of income inequality all across the globe. So when we think about how we contribute to the world, we're thinking about how we can use our technology, as was mentioned earlier, to create solutions to work on some of these challenges. But we're also thinking about how we can enable our people and think about how we can enable them to use their time differently, as well as our capital allocation. So I'll get into that a little bit as well. Next slide, please. So I just mentioned sort of using business as a platform for change. One of the ways in which we've articulated how we do it is in our annual report. So Salesforce puts out a stakeholder report every year. And you will see that this year, as well as the previous years, there's been a significant focus on the sustainable development goals. So here I've given a few of the sustainable development goals, but as a technology company, we like to think about ourselves as touching all 17 in working with our partners as well as working with our customers. But I did want to highlight a few where we think we're having a deeper impact. So in a corporate setting, when we're thinking about the sustainable development goals, it's really serving as a framework to align us around our priorities or the change we would like to see in the world as we think about how we use our business and how we use our assets. Next slide, please. So if you think about Salesforce's history back when it was began in 1999, even then Mark Benioff had this vision about how do we have a positive impact on society. So there was 1% sort of our equity earmarked for the foundation, and that was back then. Since then, the model has really evolved into this 1-1-1 model. We give 1% of our people's time, 1% of our equity, and 1% of our product towards social good. So that still comprises sort of the genesis and the backbone of what you see taking place across both Salesforce.com and Salesforce.org. In addition to that, we've taken sort of a pledge, so it's a pledge 1%, and we've banded together with other companies in saying that we will have this 1% contribution in terms of our equity. Next slide, please. So if you think about our values are really what are driving our purpose. They're really helping us sort of organize all of our employees and all of our people around the same sort of blueprint or the blueprint for success. So customer success is a key value, innovation is a key value, equality and trust, and those really underpin and underlie our purpose or how we enable business as a platform for change. Next slide. So Salesforce.org, as I mentioned, is a social impact center of Salesforce, and it is one of many. So if you think of Salesforce.org, Salesforce.org's primary focus is on using our CRM or our technology for positive change or for social good. So we work in the nonprofit space, the education space. We also work with corporations through Philanthropy Cloud on better helping them track their volunteerism and their givings. But as I mentioned, there are other sort of social impact centers or drivers at Salesforce at large. One was mentioned earlier, which is Sustainability Cloud, that's helping sort of our customers and our clients better track their carbon footprint. But in addition to that, under Salesforce Ventures, we have an impact investment fund where we are actually sort of taking a return-seeking capital approach to some of these social challenges. For example, we invest in education and workforce development, diversity and inclusion, tech for social change, climate change, racial justice. We also have a grant giving arm. So we're working across the capital spectrum, at least on the two ends of it. So in terms of grant giving, we give grants to education and workforce development. In addition to that, thinking about negative impacts or the negative side of things, we have an Office of Ethical and Humane Use. And so we are trying to mitigate against some of the future risks that technology may pose, not just thinking about AI, which is one of the most sort of popular topics that comes up, but thinking about technology at large. And we are banding with others to create that environment, to create that infrastructure where the sort of negative impacts of technology are mitigated and they're front and center. So there's that conversation taking place as well, in addition to some of the other relationships we have with sort of the largest NGOs or largest intergovernmental organizations across the world. So in terms of Salesforce.org itself, as I mentioned, there's a technology component to our platform, but technology alone is not enough if you think about sort of nonprofits and social enterprises that are struggling on the ground. I've been working more and more in terms of thinking about social enterprises. If we look globally, social enterprises are sometimes at the leading edge of solutions for communities. They are closest to the problems on the ground. They can actually give us insights into how true change can be affected and how we can bring different players together sort of in this notion of systems change. So in order for that to be successful, we need their insights in developing technology, and the technology alone is not enough. So we also sort of have our people involved through a pro bono program, and they are giving time back toward the communities to learn about them and to also contribute to the societies in which we live. So we have a strong sort of community and pro bono component. But in addition to that, there's this notion of partnerships that I mentioned. And partnerships are not just about sort of driving our product. I think more and more in the social impact space, you're seeing partnerships amongst competitors and unlikely sort of players banding together because they see sort of a broader issue or a public goods issue that needs to be solved. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have three main cloud products. One is Nonprofit Cloud, which is serving, nonprofits across the globe. We are offering it through a program called P10, where we're giving it for free or up to 10 licenses. And there's also a discounted program. There's Education Cloud. There's Philanthropy Cloud. Next slide. And then there's the pro bono piece that I mentioned. The newer piece I wanted to highlight is Impact Labs. So I think increasingly it's important for corporations to have a bridge, as I mentioned, directly to the social sector and with social enterprises, and not in sort of a one-off capacity or a volunteer capacity, but more of a long-term bridge. And I think Impact Labs helps us create that. So what Impact Labs is doing, it's bringing together some of our high impact customers as well as customers we would like to work with to crack a social sector challenge alongside, let's say, leading thinkers and leading experts from academia, from communities to work on that challenge. For example, we recently worked on homelessness. Similarly, if you think about other challenges, when you have leading players working alongside the practitioners and tech companies, you can really sort of develop solutions that are meaningful and relevant to the communities. Next slide. Next slide, please. So one of the things we recently put out earlier this fall was our community impact report. So our community impact report is apart from the stakeholder impact report that Salesforce puts out every year, which reports on some of the standards that were mentioned earlier, GRI and SASB, and sort of gives and provides our commitments to the world and mentions the SDGs. The community impact report is squarely and specifically focused on the impact of our work coming out of .org, which is our technology and our people primarily. Next slide, please. So one of the sort of assets or highlights of this report is the social value calculation. And what the social value calculation is, we've put out a quantitative dollar value on the technology that we are putting out into the ecosystem. So there's a methodology that went behind quantifying that impact through our technology. And then in addition to that, we are quantifying the value of our pro bono efforts and our pro bono work. The total is 1.09 billion. So that is the social value that .org is putting out into the ecosystem. In addition to that, what we've done is we've gone out to our customers and to our partners who are using our technology and tried to get a sense of to what extent is our technology helping them improve their efficiency, their connection to communities, their ability to collaborate, sort of innovation. How we've done that, we've done that through a Tech for Social Change survey that we give out annually, and then we report back out on those outcomes to the world, and as well as use it internally to improve some of our sort of work and our operations and to learn from it. Next paragraph. Next slide. Next slide, please. And I think this sort of notion of the business value of impact is, you can go to the previous slide, is where the rubber sort of meets the road. So as you think about business performance, these activities that I mentioned that previously and historically may have been thought of as sort of marketing plays or community plays are no longer and probably never were the case. We just were not able to measure them. There is a lot of work now taking place amongst academics, amongst niche players to tie the value of social impact activities as well as negative impacts of a business to business performance. So not on this slide, but one thing I will mention that we're trying to look at is how does the pro bono contribution of our employees lead to better business performance? One lens that we've taken is how does the pro bono contribution of our employees, let's say, reflect the purpose or the sense of purpose they feel? And the extent to which that sort of contributes to employee engagement, therefore contributes to business performance, because the link between employee engagement and business performance has now been demonstrated by some academics. So similarly, if you think about the various sort of categories of value that the types of activities that I just went through have, they include recruiting. We often hear that we are getting access to better talent because more and more millennials want to have a positive impact on the world. They want to work for corporations that have a particular type of an opportunity for them. Similarly, with retention, in terms of talent development, you talk about sort of the change maker mindset and skills of the future. Oftentimes companies that are forward leaning with regards to social impact are also those that are doing better in terms of organizing their employees and working across teams to innovate. Similarly, when you think about sort of the brand value, which is why previously there's been, let's say, such a focus on corporate social responsibility. So I'm going to talk a little bit less about that. And then here I've listed sort of this notion of reverse innovation. It should just say, I'd say innovation. We've noticed, at least at .org, there's a certain type of innovation that's taking place in partnership with the social sector. We're working with, public schools. We're working with nonprofits who are often resource strapped. Some of the lessons that we're learning there actually can be applied to our for-profit clients and our for-profit businesses. And I think risk mitigation often comes up, so I won't spend too much time on that. Next slide. Next slide. So it really comes back full circle to the notion of the purpose of our business, which is using sort of our platform as a way to affect social change. And now it is more a question for us is, apart from reporting on GRI standards, apart from reporting on sort of, SASB or TCFD or other standards, looking beyond the stick side of things, thinking of the carrot and the incentives, how can we begin to show and demonstrate through innovative reporting, such as the social value calculation, internal, innovative reporting, such as the link between pro bono and employee engagement and business performance. How can we work with, let's say, academics and other partners in the impact measurement and management space to quantify our sort of impact in terms of business performance or business value? And then how could we potentially in the future compare it with others? So here I've listed various facets of a business, because each of these in some ways has sort of policies as well as metrics associated with them, and they also can be used in a positive way to enable and drive business performance. So all across your business, there's this notion of how can you drive impact, how can you better connect it to the purpose, and what is your, for lack of better words, scorecard that goes beyond traditional materiality, that looks at, let's say, what's being called pre-financial information that hasn't yet been quantified. How do we quantify it, and how do we do it across stakeholders, not just looking at sustainability, but looking at diversity and inclusion, our ethical footprint, our philanthropy, supplier relations, responsible procurement, the entire gamut of the sort of corporate activities. And I had another slide as well in there, and I apologize that I couldn't present. And that is around this notion of sort of, and this is where I'll close out, capacity building. So as the impact measurement and management team, what we've noticed is, you know, in an ideal world, we would be able to measure all of this, but oftentimes for organizations, the capacity doesn't exist to do so. So one is sort of recognition at the board level or the leadership level that this is an important investment to make. We must be measuring and managing impact in a certain way. Yes, at forward-looking companies, the discussion is sort of increasingly robust and important, but having that level of awareness and board level support is really important, as well as then middle management and execution support. And then it comes to sort of skills. Oftentimes we're working in environments where a lot of sort of team leads don't have the skills. They are not practitioners in this space to really collect the data in a particular way, or to even utilize it and make strategic decisions based on it. So there's a skills component. Then there's a component of technology and data, which is sort of what Salesforce is trying to think about or crack. How can we better use technology, looking at the entire data value chain in terms of collection of data for reporting, but as well as sort of the strategic decision-making side. And then finally, there are other areas that were already mentioned along the lines of policy change. How can we influence policy change so that, you know, companies are held more accountable? And what is sort of the ethical footprint of the companies as well? So I think that this gives you a flavor of what Salesforce has sort of done to date, as well as how we are thinking about measurement and management in the impact space more broadly. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samira, for the presentation. I don't really have a question. I'm sure Patrick has a few questions at the end of this session. But I can just, I have a comment here. I'm a big fan of Mark Benioff, the activist CEO, and his book, The Trailblazer. So because he's one of the rare CEOs who talks about the dirty secret, the data centers. Yeah, and he's also someone I respect, because he's not only talking about net zero, he's talking about removing the excess carbon from the atmosphere. And I really like his thought process. It reminds me when we started CASI in New York, our core idea was to promote the knowledge and the cause of CSR and sustainability. So we started this company in New York, CASI, and then we went to 52 countries now. We have over 1 million students. Then we ran a volunteering platform free, and we have 3 million volunteers. We are the world's largest volunteering platform for the world's largest reach. And what we really wanted to do is we wanted every child to volunteer for 1 hour. And tree planting is something that we are working on. Women empowerment is something that we are working on. Financial literacy is something that we are working on across 52 countries. So yes, that's why I'm a big fan of this book, Trailblazer by Mark. It is good because he's not only talking about his own problems, he's trying to address the universal problem. That makes him big. So kudos to you guys. You guys are doing a good job. With
so.
that, no, of course you are. With that, we move on to John. John, my friend, please tell us your angle. What is your angle on CSR and sustainability?
Sure. Let me just hopefully you can see my slides and you can hear me. It's wonderful to join the CASI community today. And what I'd like to talk to you about is how you can be strategic, how you can design your company's strategy with the climate in mind. And I guess where we start from is the fact that whatever you make, whatever your service is, you have a role in playing in this climate emergency that we face, and also arguably a social emergency that we face in many countries too. And it's been echoed, I think, by Shameela in terms of the financial industry with the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and also with Samira and the wonderful example of Salesforce, that we're going to need different sectors and different parts of the business world to think about what their role is and how to be part of the solution. And the reason I say that is I'm going to talk to you about how a flooring company, a company that's been built on making carpet tiles that are probably in the offices that you normally are in, has been committed and passionate around sustainability for the last 26 years. And this is an example of one of our products. But I wanted to start with where it all began for us, and that was with bold leadership. This is our late founder, Ray Anderson. And back in 1994, we were hearing a question from our customers. They were starting to ask us, what are you doing about the environment? And what Ray was aware of was, as a businessman, that we might be losing business. We might be losing sales because we didn't have a good answer to that question. At the time when he asked around the business, the answer he got from our finance directors and lawyers was that we were compliant. We did enough that everyone else does. But what Ray did then was start opening up his mind to hear from scientists, to hear from NGOs. And what he learned was that carpet tile at the time, the business that he'd grown and built from the 1970s, was a really dirty business. Petrochemicals based, energy intensive. As a CEO of a large company, he had to realize that although he was doing great in terms of for his shareholders at the time, he was doing terribly for the planet. And that was a hard realization. And it's a realization that I think in the last 10 years, a lot of leaders, a lot of CEOs have had to consider. Now, what Ray decided to do next was pivotal. He decided to shift the entire focus of Interface as a company to being a more sustainable enterprise. He would use an expression when he gave talks around the world. He'd say, there really is no business case for ending life on Earth. It's very difficult to sell flooring products if we're at the end of an apocalypse. In the same way, it's not a great financial market with an apocalypse and so forth. And that's always lives with me. Instead, he said, what if we could do well as a business and do well for the planet? And from then on, we started working on how we could mitigate our negative impact. We had a mission called Mission Zero, and we worked on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So I can now share with you that since those 1990s days, we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 96%. We embraced renewable energy in our European factories. For carpet tile, 100% of our energy usage is from renewable sources. We also looked at reducing the carbon footprint of our products. And with a carpet tile, that's down by 74%. We embraced recycled and bio-based materials to a stage that across everything we make today, for carpet, 60% is recycled or bio-based. And in fact, our newest range of tiles is up to 92.8% on average. So we did a great job of doing less bad. But if we listen to the protests of young Swedish protester Greta Thunberg, or we listen to the climate strikes, doing less bad is not really enough. So we reflected on this a few years ago, alongside the ecologist Paul Hawken and the biomimicry expert Janine Benyus. And they said to us, you've done okay, you've done a good job of doing less bad, but how can you use your business to do more good? So we set about a new mission. It's called Climate Take Back. It's to run our business in a way that actually reverses the effects of global warming. And we decided to make the environment one of our key stakeholders in our strategic decisions. So our 4 stakeholders are our customers, the investment community and our shareholders, our employees, but then fourthly, the environment. And any decision we take has to take the environment into account. So the first thing we worked on was, why don't we set a new standard? What if we said that all the products that we sell could be carbon neutral? We spent 25 years looking to reduce that carbon footprint. We can use some offsets for now, for the remainder. But if we went out to the market and said, all of our floors are now carbon neutral, and that's what is the case now. But in saying that, what if we were really saying to the market, if you can make a product that's carbon neutral, why wouldn't you? And I guess one of the questions I throw kind of back to Shameela in the financial discussion would be, how does the financial market encourage bolder statements such as this, or encourage the great work that Samira and the guys at Salesforce are doing? And equally, to reflect on something that you were saying, Paresh, at the end, we've even gone further now. In the US, we've just released a carbon negative carpet tile. So in a life cycle analysis between the raw materials until it leaves our factory floor, we're able to make something that has a minus number for carbon footprint. That means it stores more carbon than would be released in its production. And again, if that's possible at the mainstream, what if our building stock, that is a representative of 39% of the carbon emissions for the planet, what if buildings could act more like carbon stores and act less as just emissions vehicles? Finally, I just wanted to pick up on another project on the social side, which was to kind of look at our supply chain and say, well, how can we have more of a social impact? Now, as you all know, the issue of marine plastic is a huge one. And within the issue of marine plastic and ocean-bound plastic, fishing nets are a huge issue. But so many fishing nets are made out of nylon 6, which is exactly the same material that we make our carpet tiles of. And then so many fishing communities are not connected to any form of waste management system, say in the Philippines or in Indonesia and Haiti. So what if we could start piecing this together? So we created a project called Networks, which takes discarded fishing nets from small communities and gives them access to the mainstream supply chain for recycled nylon. And Aquafil, one of our partners here, will take that nylon, turn it into yarn, and it will become a yarn for our carpets or clothes for Nike or for Gucci. But to do that, we needed to also bring in a more unusual partner. We worked with the Zoological Society of London, the conservation organisation, who would help us think about, well, could we use the sale of nets to help fund seaweed farming opportunities for these communities, to provide them access to another form of income? Could we create marine protected areas that would protect the fishing stocks? Because it's not easy being a fisherman in some of these locations and competing against the big commercial fleets. And also, could we help restore mangroves and develop ecotourism? Because mangroves are wonderful carbon sinks. And I guess that's one of the great ways where we just looked at a material challenge and a circular challenge, but made by having a social lens, opened us to thinking very differently. Now, Networks has been able to collect over 260 tons of nets, providing 2,000 families with access to finance and a cleaner environment for 64,000. And that's good, but it's not scale. What scale would be being able to share that with other companies. And this is the last point I'm going to finish on, which is the sharing of good ideas, which is one of the things that you guys do at CASI, and then looking to share good ideas with like-minded companies is a truly essential tool for us to combat the social and environmental problems that we face. We learned a little bit about how to do a community-based supply chain alongside Boreo, or a company that have been doing the same, very similar. And then equally, separately from us, Dell and HP had great experience of creating some of their products using marine plastic. But now we're able to share the knowledge we have with your IKEAs, your Trek bicycles, your Herman Miller furniture companies, your General Motors. When you get the idea here with Next Wave is that when you find a piece of waste plastic, it should have 5 or 6 different destinations it could go. And the aim for this group is much bigger than my 265 tons. It's looking at collecting 25,000 tons every year by 2025. So collaboration is another key word that I'm seeing. But on that point, I think I'm out of time. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share our story.
Thank you very much, John, for the presentation. Before we move on to Cristian, I have a comment, and maybe you or Cristian, either one of you or both of you can probably give me an answer or a comment on my comment. See, when we talk about sustainability or circular economy, what are we really talking about? We are talking about loop manufacturing, or we are talking about waste management. The laws are simply missing. I was reading a report by WRI saying 50% of the world's plastic waste comes from manufacturing in China, Vietnam, Philippines, and one more country. So where are the laws? So what are we talking about? The bits and pieces that we are talking about, really, are we talking about a circular economy for the world, or we are talking about circular economy for that company? A feel good factor for the company and the few shareholders, and then everybody is happy, and then we list on a stock exchange, and then we are even more happy. So what are we really talking about? I'll also I'll make one more point. I was talking to a garment manufacturer, and they are trying to work with CASI on sustainability. Research says that enough garments are already present in the world to last 9 billion people for the next 100 years. So we have already manufactured those kind of garments, and we already have those kind of garments. So how can we use less? What are we really trying to do? Maybe Cristian can start with that, or John, please.
I'll give Cristian the opportunity if he wishes to, but I've got plenty to say on the matter.
No, okay. I'm going to talk about it, Paresh, in my presentation, very short one.
From my perspective,
what are we talking about when we talk about circular economy? Circular economy, it's all about value chains and ecosystems. So the first thing we really have to think about is refusing and rethinking. We have to redesign and eco-design everything around us. So when we talk about circularity, it's really hard for an organization, and it's really hard for us in the ISO to measure it, because the value chains are really long, and we have a too much interdependent economy worldwide. So if we talk about reuse, that's okay. If we talk about remanufacturing, it's okay, but what we really have to think about is changing the paradigm of growing and development. We need to develop as a society, but we can't grow anymore, because growing is consuming more resources. So we need to thrive. A healthy economy should thrive, but shouldn't grow anymore. Please, John.
Yeah, I mean, what you're touching on there is all of the things that Shameela was talking about with donut economics and the work of Kate Rayworth. And from my side, I think the governments and the laws are always going to be slower. Like, I think there's a role of business to lead and show the way, and the forward-thinking businesses to kind of pioneer, but it must be followed up with kind of regulation. And on circularity, it's about having a proper cost on waste and realizing that there is no way in terms of when you put plastic into a bin or it goes recycling a few times and then out, it's still going to be there for a number of hundreds of years. And until we really put a proper value on waste, it will be difficult to have a circular economy. But for me, business to pioneer, regulation to follow. And we've got a global audience here, and I would admit, like, the pace of regulation in Europe will be different from the pace of regulation in India, from Chile, in South Africa. But that hopefully we'll see some of that regulation coming quicker once we do a little audit check next year at COP26 and realize that we are nowhere near where we need to be in tackling the climate crisis.
I'll just add one quick comment. One thing we've done at Salesforce is just look at our sort of supplier base and set a target about what the commitment is that 60% of our supplier base will be meeting XYZ expectation. So it's not so much a policy, but we're trying to lead the way in setting our own boundaries in terms of who we will work with and who we won't.
Sure, absolutely. I'll before we go into Cristian, we would like to hear your opinion, your angle on circular economy. But before that, I'll like to make a comment here on CASI. What we are doing is, while we are trying to work with corporates, we try to work with governments. We basically work with over 3 million volunteers, and they are all students, teenagers. And what we really believe is these students are the purchasers and the buyers of tomorrow. They can force you, your companies, your governments, they can force everyone to change, because if the buyer does not buy, you will change, and that is where we are working on. So that's really our vision, to ensure that students come on to the CASI platform for free. We do a lot of things for free, we teach a lot of things for free, and particularly circular economy, sustainability for free, in the hope that someday these students will demand, and then people will change. So that's really the long term vision that we are working on. So over to you, Cristian.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And you let me know when you see it, please. Are you seeing it?
Yeah, we are able to see it.
Yeah, this is the current situation. When first of all, I'm really honored to be here. I'm really passionate about what I do. Congrats, everyone, and especially the organizers of this, because of the gender equality. I see there's not only men talking. Then that's one thing absolutely great, should be taken in account. And I said, okay, what I'm going to talk about? I'm going to talk about circular economy. I'm going to talk about what we do creating the new ISO of circular economy and guidance for implementation. And I said, okay, there's a lot of webinars. I love them. I try to assist to every one of them. But there's a lot of webinars on circular economy. And I assume most of you, and after your presentation, I was right, know about circular economy and of course know about sustainability. So I said, I don't work in any company. I'm an advisor. So I said, I'm gonna tell you what I'm doing here in Chile. Maybe it's not in the same line of my colleagues around the world, but I think it's a great way to start a circular economy and create a momentum. And creating this momentum, I think it's gonna rush, and it's gonna be a greater shift from linear to circular. So the current situation, I think we all know about it. There's no need for me to tell you that the biggest crisis we're living in a worldwide crisis, and that crisis challenging the whole society to reevaluate the way we do things. All those crises implies reviewing the goals and strategies to achieve our objective. And in my opinion, this goal must be sustainability, not even circular economy, sustainability. And I like to understand sustainability as the absence of crisis. If there are crises, whether they are social, environmental, or economic, the system as a whole is not sustainable and must be adjusted. And here in Chile, let me tell you, we really know about crisis. We had a major social crisis, we have environmental crisis, and now with COVID-19, we have a really huge economic crisis. So in a few words, I can tell that the system is unsustainable, not less sustainable. It's really unsustainable. It can't go on like this no more. So at the same time, we know that most companies want to be sustainable. They understand that sustainable and creation of sustainable value is fundamental for business. And many times, or many webinars I give, sometimes some company man or businessman tell me, first I need to get profit, and then I can focus on sustainability. If it doesn't profit, it's not sustainable at all. I think we should understand that. And we have a lot of crises, but one crisis we don't have is a profit crisis. I mean, you were going to say, well, Cristian, you're crazy. What happens in South America that you're telling this? No, actually, we don't have a profit crisis. When society feels that a company or a product or a service adds value to society, they don't even care how much profit they get. So we don't have a profit crisis. We have a purpose crisis. So you can't profit without wondering what happens to your stakeholders, without caring what happens to the environment or what happens to the social pillar of the society. So if you do find how to get this purpose in your business, and of course if you make it circular, it's like you can profit whatever you want and no one's gonna care. And at contrary, I would say they're gonna buy your products, they're gonna prefer your products. So we see that all these companies, so they need to shift from a circular economy, from a linear economy to a circular economy. That's fundamental, that's a need, but actually it's a really complex process. It's really hard to change a whole business model. And most, for not saying all of my colleagues around the world, and in all the webinars, I always hear or listen and all the data that said that companies should change their whole business model. And I say, that's almost impossible. How can they change? I know everyone wants it. Every worker wants to be part of a committed company, be part of a sustainable company. But how can we actually do this? And so in the work we do in ISO, for the new circular economy ISO, I feel we must help companies make the transition from linear to circular, and also in a sustainable way. Circular economy is not the goal, sustainability is the goal. Circular economy is just a path. So I started thinking, okay, what I'm gonna tell you now that it's actually something that you don't already know. I mean, like it was great to listen to Cristian this time. And is there then an opportunity in CSR for all of this, for the companies to promote and foster sustainability and circular economy? And I think yes. And I think what John shows is actually what we need to do. So circular economy I was telling Paresh, is all about ecosystems and value change. That's something that's the base of it. So corporations and companies have a double responsibility. On one hand, they must shift their business model from linear to circular, okay? And on the other hand, how can they effectively do that and support and thrive the ecosystems where they belong? It's like, whoa, how I'm gonna do this and think about it when most of my time is expended keeping the business alive and growing, not developing. That's a problem, but we're gonna talk about it in another webinar. And growing. So I started working a couple of years ago in a methodology for corporations to not become circular, but to gain and achieve circular goals. I mean, let's start thinking for a moment, not in a circular organization at all, but in circular products, services, as Samira said, circular suppliers. So when we think then in circular attributes, circular implementations, instead of a whole circular organization or company, you can see that you can focus CSR in using circular and sustainable ecosystem solutions that promotes positive impact on the vast majority of stakeholders. I mean, when I have a problem and I can realize which is my problem, maybe I don't need to change it inside my organization because there's a whole startup and innovation ecosystem around me that has already that solution, but not a circular business model when we can work together. And if I evaluate these startups, these SMEs in a sustainable rubric, I can choose startups or innovation companies that already has social impact in their business model, that already had solutions for environmental problems. And I am not even changing my organization. I'm not hiring new people. I'm not changing. So I'm what it takes and what it's hard for change for people. It doesn't matter actually here because they're already doing what they always have done, but in a sustainable way. I mean, let's start changing few parts of the company and that drives the ecosystem around us and create a momentum. So it's like throwing a stone in a lake. Actually, it's like throwing a stone in a lake. The synergy that is generated both inside with the workers and outside the company in the whole ecosystem, that includes communities, that includes gender equality, those are this necessary momentum. And in my opinion, that accelerates the change to a new circular, sustainable, and of course, resilient economy, because we also improve local industrialization. So this is the way I visualize it. And this is for you. We have a linear economy company that needs to shift to circular. And we have a whole ecosystem of startup solutions, communities, everything you need to know about your stakeholders that are already there. So you can use the CSR as a matchmaker. I mean, they are well invested resources that start circularizing or circularizing the company. I mean, you're not going to change the business model of the company, but you're gonna be reducing your carbon footprint. You're gonna be improving the conditions of the communities around you, your impacts on the ecosystem, and that momentum it's not something that I just think about. I was not going to show this next slide, but I'm going to say it to you to let you know that I've already done it. So it's not like, what are you talking about? Chris, that sounds great, but here Replay is one of the 3 largest retail companies in Chile and South America. And we started working approximately 1.5 years ago, no more than that. We started with a project where I applied this methodology that I'm telling you, and it comes all the social crisis here in Chile, and I was like, wow, this is not gonna work anymore because there are riots everywhere and they're closing the stores, and it was like a boom. It was like great, everyone loves it, and it started creating momentum inside the company, inside the workers, and now. We have a circular business model that's not actually of Replay, but it reduces the whole impact of the e-waste that they produce. And we have right now, just in this model, we have 5 startup and SMEs working in this model with fair trade, obviously, with a great impact, environmental impact, with low salarial gaps, with low payment gaps, with gender equality, and they just realized then, Ripley, this is the third, sorry, the second, the third is going to be in a couple of months. The second project we've done using this way of stakeholder engagement in a certain way. Oh, okay. No, I think that's it. So they use this model. They didn't have to invest developing the solution. They just have to realize which were the problems, and then looking to engage with their stakeholders and look at the ecosystem and realize they're not alone anymore. The company doesn't work in a vacuum, and this interdependence between all the actors in the ecosystem is fundamental for a circular economy worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cristian, for that presentation. The case studies were very interesting. I will get back to you offline. I have a few detailed questions on those companies. In a sense of time, we have a time for a couple of questions. But before that, I would like to invite Shameela again for a few closing thoughts. Shameela Soobramoney.
Thank you, Paresh. I'm not sure what you wanted in terms of closing thoughts, but when I was listening to the other speakers, it occurred to me that, I could have maybe spent a bit more time talking about the JSE's overall approach as the company and looking at its role broadly and how it's come to where it has in influencing sustainability and sustainable development. Sorry, I took the time limit very seriously
Please share that.
at 18 minutes and kept strictly to it. So obviously was, kind of restricted on the content. So when I think about the exchange, our perspective and our work in this space goes back probably just under 20 years, and was really with that explicit understanding that every company needs to fundamentally rethink its position in society and what it can contribute and how it can influence sustainable development. So with that in mind, the exchange effectively says it's got this balancing act between its three faces that it wears in the context of the JSE. The first being the JSE, the exchange, so the platform that enables the transactions to happen. The second one being the regulator, because in our context specifically, we're also a regulator. And so, we develop the listing rules and the like, and our frontline regulator in that regard. And that is both for listings rules as well as for market surveillance rules. So things, all the great things you see in the movies around insider trading and the like, there's a particular division that monitors that and ensures those sorts of things are kept, well in line for the market. And then the third phase, of course, is the JSE Limited, the company itself, which is a corporate entity like any other one. And so how do we use those three faces together to create an enabling environment? And so our positioning was really to say, ultimately, an entity like the JSE is a connector. It brings together a number of different parts of the financial ecosystem. It brings together issuers and investors, so people who are looking for capital to run their businesses and hence have an impact on the economy, and then those that have capital to give and are looking for investment opportunities. And in between, there's a whole spectrum that comes together to create that. Surrounding that is an entire ecosystem also that helps to enable these things to happen. And so our role is to see what we can directly influence and where we can work together with the balance of that ecosystem, for example, that has a purview over things like governance. So there's a broader system that needs to work together, and it's not just one entity like the exchange. So how does it work together to create the outcome that we want? And so when we look at that, I think I can quickly share a slide actually, that what that actually means for us. Please just bear with me a second. Okay, so if I bring this up, I want to just share this, then you can see. So the context and that focus for sustainability, you see on the top right, I'm talking about the company, the exchange, and the regulator, and saying we're a central player. And one of the questions posed to me earlier was about liquidity. I think Professor Paresh, your question as well, is that you're a central player in an economy. What can you do? You need to ensure, first and foremost, sustainable access to capital and fair access to a deep and liquid trading platform, but then also the voice and the regulatory tools to influence stakeholder behavior. So that's where we're trying to find that delicate balancing act, because it wouldn't be in anybody's best interest for a company to just unlist completely or delist completely and then be lost to the public domain. And with it goes transparency, with it goes disclosure in the public domain, and the benefits that society gets from publicly listed entities and the ability that that information disclosure has to enable society at large to engage with what that company is doing. So balancing these has been part of how we consider that. First and foremost, support that robust market, ensure the basics of what an exchange needs to do is done, so that our pension funds, for example, have a place in which to invest and that the basics of market functionality sits there. Then when we look at our own stakeholders, we need to lead by example, integrating sustainability and the SDGs into our operations. And so look at the balance between into running a sustainable business, and the external sphere of control and influence that we have. And we bring that together to create an enabling environment for better sustainability practices and disclosure to grow. Sustainability, as I mentioned before, being part of good governance. So if you look at the regulatory framework, I won't go into that in detail because I've mentioned the King codes, I've mentioned the mandatory disclosure requirements in answer to one of the questions earlier on. And that's we're one player in a broader governance ecosystem. So what can we push and how can we enable? The second one was the tools and opportunities on the right-hand side of the screen. So what can we do in tools and services? And there we're looking at saying, in the equities market, we've got the Responsible Investment Index. Its predecessor, the SRI Index, was the first ESG index in the world that was exchange sponsored. And this is in an emerging market. This is not a developed country development. So this is, the first in its world exchange sponsored. And what that did is create a very strong signaling effect, and it created an aspirational element in the South African market. So companies started using this ESG kind of rating process and the tool that underlied it to say, this is how we can start thinking about sustainability from a disclosure perspective. But behind that, hopefully, was the business practice and the behavior change that started to happen, and started seeing that companies, it became aspirational for them to be included in an ESG index. And over time, we've seen that, and we've changed criteria. It's become more and more strict. It's broad-based ESG. So there are now 14 themes around that actually companies need to disclose on. So much so that right now, if you look at the work that's been done by the Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative and Corporate Knights reporting, South Africa is one of the top 5 in the world for ESG disclosure. And this is in a voluntary regime, but using that enabling environment to try to promote better practice and behavior. And so even better in many instances than some of the developed markets who have rules and regulations that promote sustainability disclosure. So of course, practice and disclosure can be two different things, and one needs to be cognizant of that. But we're using the tools and levers that we can as an exchange to create better practice amongst businesses. And we're using the carrot approach rather than the stick approach. Whereas many indices, for example, want to be exclusionary in nature and say, take out your sin stocks, your tobacco, interest-bearing, whatever your moral or ethical screening is. We've taken a broader approach to say, let's encourage everybody to do better in relation to how they think about sustainability. And so that's the kind of effect that the tools and services have had. Then when we look at the other asset classes, we're now creating enabling investment vehicles for that to happen. Green bonds being expanded to the sustainability segment, where now you can issue social sustainability and green bonds. We're looking at, we've got derivatives contracts on our Sustainable Development Top 30 Index. I showed you the performance of that index before. Strong case looking at investment, project bonds, all the other things that enable money to flow focusedly into sustainable development are some of the things we're looking at. And we've developed in such a way that we have upfront created the ability to expand that. So the thinking is to say, how can we create more tools as the need arises? And then the other two levers that we found to be particularly useful for us is advocacy and engagement. So what do we do as an entity ourselves into going to the global spaces and saying, how can we use the experience we've had to help influence others, but at the same time, how do we learn from best practice that is changing rapidly? And I would say in the last 2 years, we've seen significant developments in sustainability that suggest that we could learn from what's happening in other jurisdictions, bring that best practice back to our market, and therefore enable our companies to be set up in a manner that allows for them to attract investment and to actually create longer term resilience that allows them to be better and more attractive investment options. So how do we do that is creating that, having the advocacy space and doing that in many global and local platforms, and then engagement on the other hand, which says that there's still a number of entities that are behind the curve on sustainability. They don't believe it's important, or so at the early stage of that development, how do we help by engaging to create them the knowledge share that's required and bring together issuers and investors? Because one of the points that was made earlier was around, if you're seeing consumer demand shifting, if you're seeing investors starting to change, that's when practices are really going to start changing, when the money is looking for the better practices. And so an opportunity for engagement is one of the critical ones that we're seeing has a big multiplier effect across the market, and how can we facilitate that? So for me, this is really the story of where the JSE says, how do we use the different opportunities we have to come together to influence sustainable development, understanding that we actually have a massive multiplier effect. So whereas some of the examples that were shared before talk about looking up the supply chain and how you can influence that, looking to the side for the other connections and other part of the community and how you can influence that and work together, this is the way in which we have actualized a similar sort of approach. And then seeing within that, for example, different topics. We know business models need to change. Can we facilitate something on circularity? We know that there's a particular need for SME development. How do we potentially help SMEs to filter into the supply chains of our big blue chip companies listed on the JSE? So there are a number of areas in which we can facilitate that. And then CSI, I haven't even mentioned because I just see CSI as something that you do beyond those. But sustainability is at the heart of how you can change things. And on our CSI practice is an extension of what we think of sustainability and answering to some of the issues that we can't directly touch on in our business, but that are major pressing issues in society. Financial inclusion in South Africa is a massive issue. And we have a big CSI program that is working directly with the education departments, filtering that into curriculum to enable better education, for example, across the country to bring financial literacy where it's necessary. We have huge engagements at a community level to help with alleviating poverty, all of those kinds of things. Where can we get involved? How do we use our connections and our networks to do that? And so that's a part, like I said, I haven't spoken about because I guess my bias is to say that this is not a CSI discussion. This is about fundamentally changing how you think and how you use your business to influence change. So, and then in our case, with the number of listed companies, that is a massive multiplier effect back into society. If you take a simple thing like a disclosure requirement, what does that do to enable stakeholder engagement across the market, where then you're making the information available for investors, issuers, society at large to start engaging with those companies and saying, okay, you've said you've done this on gender diversity, you've done this on racial diversity. Let me talk to you about that. What does that mean in practice? And so you create that enabling environment for the practices to start changing. And so that's where we see ourselves as the JSE. And I think where we look at every opportunity to work across the spectrum. And we also see this as being a very much an evolving discussion, because literally every few months there's new thinking on sustainability. There's new thinking about how one can reduce your impact, how you can increase positive impact. All of that is changing. And so we need to constantly be on top of that to help our entire market evolve to best practice. So I'll leave it at that, Paresh, and I hope it just gives you a bit of an insight of things I didn't touch on in depth in the JSE, just more in the interest of time earlier, but thank you.
Thank you very much for that integrated approach. I will take it offline with you. We had a discussion on how CASI is trying to set up an international ESG exchange. So we could definitely use your help in that. Patrick, of course, is a part of that. So we will definitely reach out to you offline, and maybe we could do something together at the CASI International ESG Exchange. And that is something we are setting up for corporates around the world. And a lot of SME MMEs are on our radar. So we are making it for companies who are not listed, and they can also submit their sustainability reports. So that is it.
Can I just make a comment on something that John actually mentioned earlier on? And I think his question was, so how are investors actually rewarding the kind of ambition that a company like his has set out for himself? And, he did a brilliant job of speaking about what they've done, and he made it so simple, but there's so much tied up in what he said. So yesterday, in fact, we hosted an investor panel. And when you get down into it, investors are maybe not as vocal, but I think maybe a bit more savvy than we give them credit for sometimes. And what came out very clearly in this global investor panel that we hosted was that much of that effort is now being directly related to the cost of capital. And that is where it's coming through. They're looking at those impacts. They are looking at the ways in which it fundamentally affects risk, affects value creation. And that's the way in which it's starting to have that impact back into some of the pricing, in the weighting of those issues and whether they made the investment case. And, if you look at the way in which they factor in sustainability, often that is what they call the ESG integration approach. So you don't explicitly see it. But what was clear from what I saw yesterday is that it's starting to factor into how they consider the risk-adjusted return. And so really starting to see that coming into investment practice. So I think it's an important case to make, because that's really where the rubber hits the road and where companies start becoming rewarded for this effort. And we're seeing a move away from some of the original thinking around somehow, if you invest in sustainability, it means that you're going to take a knock in profit or somehow going to negatively impact your financials. And the difference is due. So a number of factors coming together to prove the counterpoint. In fact, the issue of millennials was touched on earlier. That's just one of the big issues that are coming together to say there's a fundamental shift in the different generations, in the thought processes, but also because we're now able to more easily quantify risk. That is a big narrative that's changing the agenda and allowing us to have a more long-term approach, because that entrenched short-termism is actually what is fundamentally wrong with the system. And so even concepts like circularity have struggled because we're still rewarding short-term return. And so as that starts to change and we entrench long-termism and the thinking on long-termism, and that needs an entire shift even in the investor mindset. And that, again, we're starting to see from things like model mandates coming through, looking at rewarding longer term behavior and pricing that in. So, it's not perfect by any means right now, but I think those positive signs are ones we need to look for, ones we need to encourage, and to your students out there to really apply your minds to understanding how to measure and price these things. Because when we bring that in is when we really see companies like John's being rewarded for the effort that they're making.
Thank you for those comments. That brings us to end of our session. We have time for one or two questions, so we can invite Patrick, Francis, or Wanda to ask the questions. On a lighter note, John, two speakers, really appreciated your presentation today. So we should definitely have John as a repeat speaker at a few of our next seminars. So. Patrick, Wanda, do you have a question? Francis?
Can I go first, Paresh?
Oh, please.
Okay, just a question to Shameela, because I do notice that, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is quite of a frontier in terms of ideas of sustainability, right? So I just want to ask this question that, today I think the biggest in terms of sustainability is about climate change. But I don't see a lot of, I don't read a lot of South African corporates, going into science-based targets. So is there a push by GSC to get corporates in South Africa to set targets based on science-based targets?
So carry on.
Shameela, yeah, it's to you, Shameela.
Okay. Right. So on science-based targets, that is really where we're seeing that the opportunity is to help with encouraging the disclosure on those levels. We are obviously closely monitoring a lot of the global developments that are happening. So one of the dominant ones in terms of climate change disclosure is, of course, the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And that is pushing to say, well, what do we do? How do you start aligning your scenarios and your activities, and then looking at aligning with the Paris Agreement, for example? So what we're doing right now is trying to understand what is the best place for the exchange in this regard. I think I slightly disagree with you about the science-based targets part of it, because our discussions with corporates have been that they do start seeing this clearly. I mean, just the day before yesterday, for example, we had Sasol, and Sasol is one of the largest emitters in the country, and then we had Investec Bank, which is a global bank, very active in the UK and South Africa, also talking about how they're starting to align with TCFD. So I think that process is happening. And if you look at TCFD, it does allow, a few years for you to be able to get on board. I think that some of it is not as vocal, so it's happening behind the scenes. It's really very much the nature of South Africans to go slowly and quietly while they're developing and not be vocal. And so when they're ready and they have it in place, they'll announce it. So I really think you're going to see more of that coming. Sasol has already set 2030 targets, and now they said by next year they're going to come out with 2050 targets. That is a massive move for a company like that with huge emissions. And, so those things I think are slowly but surely happening. Of course, the global pressures are coming to bear, particularly if you're a company that's a multinational and seeing the pressures in other countries, that's going to happen. So our move is going to be to say, how do we start encouraging? How do we potentially put out guidance on what needs to happen? We're currently involved with the Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, co-chairing with the London Stock Exchange, an effort on developing broadly as climate change disclosure guidance for exchanges on what they can do to encourage their market. So we will align with that disclosure, sort of paper that we're going to put out, and hopefully that happens around June next year, just before the COP. That's the idea, so that we can have and move together as exchanges on what can be done and enable that within the ecosystem. Within the context in South Africa, there's a lot that's happening at the national government level with National Treasury and the like, and so we're working with them to see what is the full framework that we want to develop as a country, and then we work together in that broader environment for governance and disclosure as well. So, we're in the movement, so I can't tell you exactly now, but those are the things that are lining up, and I think within the next year, we will see significant change in that regard.
Thanks, Shameela. Paresh, can I ask another question?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, I give Patrick a chance to ask because it's quite late.
What, you want me to? If you have a second question, please go ahead.
Okay, again, back to Shameela, because we look at South Africa, history of South Africa, because, you've got the appetite and all that. And then earlier you were mentioning in your presentation where you're using your sustainability around metrics. You say you've got two parts. One part is the voluntary part. The other part, you make it mandatory, where you talk about companies disclose on the agenda, the race and all that, right? So you talk about the company itself, you're getting the company to do that. But do you see that translating across the country to rebalance the structure of the country? This is directed to Shameela. Yeah.
So that's a difficult one, right? Because you want to measure that rebalance, and you can definitely start seeing the transformation happening. So remember that the disclosure point covers board level for gender and for racial diversity. When you look at that and you start plotting it year on year, and the fact that that disclosure requirement also looks for companies to talk about their plans in relation to those two particular measures, you're starting to see that shift happen at the board level. And so, there are different metrics. Of course, the board is one level, then there's management team. There's, below that, there are different levels on which these things can be measured. Are we seeing the change? We absolutely are. I think in terms of both gender diversity and racial diversity, we're starting to see the shift. I actually don't have the stats on hand, I'm sorry, but we can, we have definitely seen that is starting to happen. And I think that the fact that you have to disclose makes it a little bit difficult to not start bringing about the change. Because people do ask, why hasn't it? Why has your gender, diversity not changed? Why has your racial diversity not changed in the positive way? And so those changes are starting to happen. We definitely are seeing, for example, more robust engagement on remuneration as well. And some of that linked to the fact that that policy needs to be put to vote annually. And then behind the closed doors discussions on remuneration policy when you have dissenting voters. So we're seeing the shift happening on the engagement on those issues and in the numbers that quantify some of that change on those dimensions that the disclosure is required on. That also, you must remember, particularly in terms of racial diversity, is part and parcel of the broader national reporting requirements, right? Because the Department of Labor and the like ask companies to report on much more granular detail in their labor reports too. So, those things are starting to shift. That looks a lot more deeply. Ours is obviously concerned with what is in the public domain on those particular measures and starting to change the governance structure, at least because the board level has this huge governance responsibility and diversity at that level. We know the evidence has shown to say that is fundamentally supportive of better company behavior or better company performance in the long term.
Thank you.
Yeah. Patrick, Wanda, do you have a question?
Wanda, go ahead.
Wanda, you are on mute.
Okay. First, I would like to say thank you very much that I could have opportunity to be here, because it was very interesting for me. I would like to say that I read a book about interface many years ago, and it was very impressive for me. And I would like to ask Cristian if it is really that 93% of CEO is thinking that sustainability is the only way for future, because what 93% from what group of CEO you have such information? And for Shameela, I would like to ask the question if if really all listed companies on your stock exchange are doing such disclosure of non-financial information, because I heard that maybe it is my fault that I didn't hear good enough your presentation. Sorry for my English.
No problem. Do you want Cristian to go first?
That's okay. Hi, Wanda. Thanks for your question.
Yep,
that information came from a Center UNA Global survey and a study on sustainability that was made last year. And it was it was more than 1,000 companies which CEOs were interviewed and surveyed about sustainability. What I think we have to make the difference is, one thing is that they think sustainability is important for their business, and other completely different thing is that they implement or improve sustainability in their business. It's the way I look at this, it's like a survey from healthy food and exercise. I think 95% of the people would say it's great to eat healthy and exercise, but less than 10% of the same people actually do exercise or eat healthy. So that's from the UNEX Center study, and they do understand that it's fundamental, but unless there's some market change from the consumers, that we talk about it recently, they don't feel like they have to make this change or the shift quite yet. So they're just waiting for things to become worse in a way of saying, to make this change and start being really sustainable.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Wanda, in relation to all companies disclosing on these issues, so I think that the levels of disclosure certainly change according to the size of the company. And by and large, not to generalize, but it does seem to be the trend is that the companies with more resources are able to disclose better and apply more resources to the function of both applying their mind to sustainability and then reporting on that and then disclosing accordingly. So there's certainly a skew towards better reporting at the upper end of the market cap. And so that's definitely a trend that we see. A lot of the time with the smaller companies, just the burden of keeping going occupies their day-to-day kind of mind. And so it's almost like of the sustainability stuff, it's just, how do I have time to now think about this and apply my mind and report on it? So there is hugely the opportunity to start looking at assisting companies on the smaller end of the market cap to improve their disclosure and to help them with that. So that's what I think the gap is really in providing more of a hand-holding and tools and services in that end of the market to improve the disclosure. It is certainly skewed to the bigger market cap companies for the better disclosure, certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. With that, we come to a hard finish of today's seminar. So again, I would like to thank everyone, the speakers, the audience, Patrick, Wanda, Hayden, thank you very much for being here. Francis, thank you. And especially the speakers. This was a truly amazing session, and it was truly a global session. We have people from across the world today. Yeah. So thank you all very much for your support. Thank you.
Well done, Paresh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.